Thank you very much for inviting me, Madeline. I'm very pleased to be here, although I also have a disclaimer. I also flew after asking Madeline how I could get here without flying. And my other disclaimer, I guess, is that I don't come to meetings like this anymore because I find them actually quite painful. But actually, I also think that you can't have discussions about ethics without being in the room with people. I also asked the technical staff whether they would include the people we've got online if they want to participate in the discussion. And I guess my other disclaimer is I'm actually from a mining family, and related to what Andre said earlier on, it turns out that I'm one of the first women in my college in Cambridge, first member of my family to go to university, and one of the first state school students to get into my college in Cambridge, which is actually very recent. It's only in the late 1980s. I'm going to explore one of the central questions that Nordforsk posed for us, which is what would rethinking rights be in the 21st century? And related to what Mickey said, I guess, although I've traveled most of my life, I went to India when I was 17. I probably am a very good Catholic girl, so I'm going to obey the instructions of Nordforsk, and I'm going to be rational for as much as I can. So I'm going to give you a two-part story. I'm not going to cover really the human health and planetary health crisis, although I've spent most of my career as a kind of reluctant scientist documenting inequalities, working on environmental justice. But my original training was in literature and philosophy. And I've been teaching what's called, in a slightly colonial way, development ethics at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine for around 25 years. So I'm going to just run us through what depresses me at the moment, and then pose a question which I'd be interested to discuss with all of you about whether we can actually advance the conceptual breadth of how we think about rights, and then the practice of justice and rights if we incorporate other philosophical, cultural traditions, which is in fact what both the previous speakers have been talking about as well. So I want to start with something that actually chimes very well with what Andre was saying at the very beginning. If you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was drafted in 1948 by 9 people. The only really non-Western educated person was a playwright from China. And he argued that the declaration should contain more than Western ideas. But then in a compromise, once he had been convinced of universalism, he then insisted, from a perspective of Confucian's ideas, that you should remove all allusions to nature and God. And this comes back to some things that Mickey was saying earlier on about the way that economists relate to us and talk to us about rationality. And this is Eleanor Roosevelt. The other point I want to make about this slide is related to something else that Andre said at the very beginning. I find it absolutely extraordinary that 5 of the 9 people who drafted this declaration were born in the 1880s and 1890s. And all of them grew up with the historical reality of both the First and Second World Wars. None of them were born after that period. So their vision was totally constrained by that period. As we all are, we all live in our own history. Out of that, you get 2 incredibly strong strains of both theory and practice. So these are 2 classic texts, one around theory and practice of human rights and the other around law. And they both come from an incredibly Western orientation, a rational, logical way of thinking about the world. And these are the texts that we use to teach in the London School. And what I've been trying to challenge students to think about is actually, if we think about these as colonial texts, how do we challenge them and move forward in the 21st century? Colonial white male texts, actually, principally as well. Not that I'm any different as a white woman, probably. One of the challenges we have in moving forward, and one of the reasons I always get nervous about talking about this, I don't mind talking about this when I'm not being recorded in my teaching, but it's almost like challenging a biblical or Quranic text to challenge the human rights agreement we have, because it was considered, although it was just one text, it was considered the first attempt by all humanity to document a morality of the depths, which I find really interesting, going back to the metaphors we were talking about earlier on. But one of the reasons, I'll explain why I find this depressing in a second. But again, this is another American white man. I'm not going to go into this, but one of the things I've written about quite a lot is inequality, as have many people. Amartya Sen is one of those who I admire most. I first started writing about this around 25 years ago. And one of the things that shocks me is when we are talking about inequality in the world, and I know the following speaker is of a philosophical tradition who will possibly challenge what I'm about to say, but it astonishes me that almost half the world's population are still attempting to live on less than $7 a day. And this is the World Bank upping their estimate on basically what's livable. This is personal parity. And then we have this new concept, and I don't know how many of you followed this, but this week Credit Suisse released a new report on what they call global wealth. And they were documenting that the number of this new category, again, coming back to the metaphors that we were talking about earlier, a new term that's entered the language, which is ultra-high net worth individuals. Now, these are people, I thought Mickey was going to talk about the really unbearably privileged. These are people who earn more than 50 million a year. So these are really ultra rich people. I know that a lot of people who work on climate change consider that to be irrelevant to any debate about climate change. But for me, this, and I put this out here for us to discuss perhaps, this actually drives a model of aspiration. So it's not that it's problematic that there's inequality now, it's problematic for the implications it has for the models of aspiration it gives to everyone in the world. So poverty in the context of technological communication and access to information about all these people becomes relative to that wealth. So relative poverty is no longer what my neighbor has, it's what Kim Kardashian has. It's a completely different concept of poverty. Moving on, the other thing that depresses me is one of the things we discussed earlier on, which is if you create an incredibly anthropocentric version of rights, A, we haven't got anywhere near achieving the elimination of the morality of the depths, and B, we have excluded everything else from our concept of rights. So I'm not going to go into this because I want to move on to the more positive aspects of this. This is an eagle in the reserve where I was living in Argentina. She lost her eye, and she can't fly anymore because she can't balance. My colleagues in the park kept her alive simply because she's very gentle, and they take her around schools to help children to understand what it is to disable an animal like this. What worries me is if we consign everything else on the planet to concepts that my colleagues in WHO believe will change policy, like describing things as ecosystem services, we then force relationships that are completely untenable. So I'm just going to show you one slide about this. I find it extraordinary that WWF, who I worked for many years ago in Liberia, are now using concepts like ecosystem services to try and justify the protection of oceans. Now, you can maybe justify fish because we eat them. It gets a bit more tricky when you're talking about jellyfish, stingrays, sharks. It becomes much more tenuous when you start to justify, as WWF did a few years ago, snow leopards as ecosystem indicators of something. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, but my colleagues in conservation science have also, and I find this astonishing, started to have debates about the use of a concept that comes from war medicine, which is triage, to apply that to ecosystems and species. Now, triage was a not very nice, but logical way of choosing between soldiers in a situation of extremity. Conceptually and morally, I find it absolutely extraordinary that conservation scientists are so depressed that they would start to debate triage as a concept between species or between ecosystems. And if you're interested, there's a very emotional debate going on amongst scientists. And I guess while we're talking about depressing things, the UK government was extraordinarily proud last year to produce the Dasgupta Review, which is the economics of biodiversity. Now, if you're an economist, you may think that this is the rational way to get humans to think about nature. I get it. I really do get it. But what I was reflecting a lot last night on what Birgitte said yesterday about humans as narcissists. I don't know whether I agree with her, but I certainly don't believe it. I don't know whether rationally I agree with her. But also fundamentally in my life, in my experience, in all the places I've lived and worked, many of which have been very dangerous, I have never experienced narcissists. This I find an extraordinarily narcissist perspective. It may be considered a rational perspective, but it is total hubris for us to think that that perspective will take us out of our situation, in my view. Right, that's the nasty part of the story. Now I want to go on to the happy bit. I want to put some other voices on the table, and they're around procedural justice, which I find quite interesting, decolonizing the debate, and thinking about the rights of nature by incorporating other cultures. So I'm going to cover quite a lot of generalizations very quickly. I just wanted to include William Blake because I adore William Blake. Actually, this ties very much into the last two talks because William Blake argued back in the 1790s, this is his parody of Newton. There's a huge statue of this outside the British Library in London. Newton, for William Blake, who was a poet and a woodcarver, typified science as the tree of death rather than the tree of life, which he called art. And the only reason I have that here is because it's very easy for us to be ahistorical and think that we're inventing this new wonderful world with One Health. But in fact, through history, people have been arguing that we need to be more holistic around the way we think about the world around us. On a happy note, one of the things I think is quite interesting, if you're into practical ways of dealing with things, the Aarhus Convention in 2001 was a victory for environmental NGOs. And this is when you get clever lawyers. You know, lawyers can be, Dante put them at the bottom of hell for a reason, with us, with the medics, of course. But the interesting thing about interesting lawyers is they think about procedural justice. So we were talking yesterday about the rights of people to be involved in research. And the necessity of the moral ethic to involve them, which we were talking about last night as well. But actually, the Aarhus Convention would argue that substantive justice for people is not only their right. So this is a bit of an advance on the American concept of environmental justice. But procedural justice is their right. So you can't fight an oil company, for example, as a community, if you don't have information. So this is a very old idea. You were describing your love of Aristotle. Well, information as a form of power was an idea from way before that even. And the idea of participation, people have the right to be involved in environmental decision-making. And I was quite interested last week because Friends of the Earth, if you're interested in this, there is the European Commission still has a website for the Aarhus Convention. It is in force. At the time, the then Secretary General, Kofi Annan, as I said yesterday, thought this was enormously important as environmental democracy. So if you argue, as we were arguing earlier on, that people with less money can be equally enfranchised, then this is a form of enfranchisement. The other thing that's quite interesting, we were discussing this yesterday, and Birgitte said that Sweden hadn't signed up to the ILO Convention about rights of indigenous people. But Sweden has signed up, as have all nations. There are some abstentions, but the only nations that have not signed and ratified the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People are Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the US. Principally because this conceptually is fascinating because it argues that indigenous people have more rights to land than other people, which raises the whole issue of how you define indigeneity, who is indigenous to land, who owns the land fundamentally. The logic of this was that indigenous peoples were taking care of land, and there's quite a lot of evidence to show that in places like Brazil, the areas controlled by indigenous people actually have better biodiversity because they are protected better by the indigenous communities. So there's a logic to this as well. But for me, this is an advance because this is the least enfranchised people getting rights. It's not hard law, it's soft law, but I won't go into that. Then the other interesting thing that's happening is you can always tell that the UN are threatened when they put out a statement saying everything's all right. So this is the UN talking about universality and cultural rights. And the reason that they are putting out this statement is they're worried that any discussion around cultural diversity and the human rights legislation that we have will change the universalism of rights. So the reason that that's actually important is if you then keep arguing that we have to keep a doctrine that started in the late 1940s as it is, because otherwise we might open the doors to genital mutilation, for example, then you actually close the doors to any conceptual enrichment of that legislation. However, if you take a slightly more decolonizing view, this is an interesting perspective from a philosopher, an African philosopher, who would argue that one of the problems of the rights legislation we have to even ensure the morality of the depths is that we are not talking about duties. So we conceptually have both a very individual claim, but we also have a very individual rights versus individual rights idea, rather than a duties and rights idea. And he would argue that the African language of duty moves us closer to being able to understand how we might be morally responsible for some things, which is what we were talking about slightly yesterday. The only other thing I'll say about this is a young man, I was thinking about this last night, this is a young man in Liberia who must be a grandfather if he's still alive. And the thing beside him says, when the sea is rough, the fish don't mind, which is another concept that comes very much from other cultural perspectives around the importance of respecting nature, I guess. This is a Hindu philosopher, and his critique would be, again, around Christianity and the way in which pre-Christian religions actually considered life as much more important. This is the Celtic tree of life. So if you then come back to the human rights legislation, that was very much written with a Judeo-Christian orientation, taking God out, but nonetheless anthropocentric. And the critique here is that that made nature man's monopoly. If you are interested in, if you like, decolonizing the debate a bit, this is a very interesting anthology called called A Critical Moral Imperialism Anthology. Now that's around the idea that if we are to advance conceptually, this is what we were talking about earlier on in terms of paradigm shifts, I guess, and in terms of my personal coherence, I am trying to make that more real, but in terms of paradigm shifts, I think it's actually quite important that we have practical ways of shifting paradigms as well. And one of them potentially is what in very interesting language, Boaventura de Sousa Santos describes as diatopical hermeneutics. Now that sounds very fancy, but what he really means is no one culture can understand the whole. So science can't, we were talking about this yesterday, science can't understand the whole, one culture can't understand the whole, one language cannot. If you actually have an equal discussion that's reciprocal between cultures or debates, you actually move to what he would describe as diatopical hermeneutics, which you might not find interesting, but we've been trying this with our students over the last couple of years because they come from all over the world. And they find this quite interesting, but it's actually extraordinarily challenging to see how you would practically put this into practice. But I guess Joanne was talking about this a little bit in terms of shifting conceptual understanding when you actually engage with people with experiential knowledge rather than learned knowledge. And the fact that you actually move a little bit closer to knowledge as emancipation with an approach that opens you up a bit. Now, this all may sound very airy-fairy, But one of the things I want to practically say is I think it's a major advance that UNDP and their very fancy scientists and statisticians are going to start to work up a new formula to discuss where human development's going. So they effectively want to move from money, health, life expectancy, education, and actually put a measure of the impact of a society on their environment and their sustainability to every country. So hopefully America will come out worse, closely followed by Australia and the UK. But actually that will be really interesting because that's the first time practically that any UN statistical analysis of what's going on in the world in terms of development would have actually put into play a measure of our impact on other creatures. I'm going to finish with a couple of slides just to say that at the same time as we're having this workshop, UNESCO is funding a workshop on multiculturalism, again focused on the environment, in Thailand, just at the same moment that we're talking about this, which is, for me, very interesting. These are people who I was in a meeting with in Bangalore a couple of years ago. And they're actually bringing back onto the table cultural diversity and religion, which has been in the black box for a few centuries. I'm not going to focus on this, actually, but when I showed my students this, they said very much what you said. This is a study from Southampton, where they basically identified 6 practical things that the globally privileged could do, which included the plant-based diet, but also included things that my students found themselves impossible to sign up to. Buying no more than 3 new items of clothing, keeping electrical products for at least 7 years, taking no more than 1 short-haul flight every 3 years, getting rid of your personal motor vehicle, and making at least 1 shift to nudge the system, like moving to green energy, insulating your home, or changing pension supplier. I'm not going to go into that. My students were completely committed to changing their lives until they saw this list. I'm going to finish again with something from India. I don't know how many people are familiar with Jainism, which is a branch of Hinduism, which comes from 2,500 years ago. I'm very interested in Jainism because it's not only a culture which believes that every living thing has a soul, but it's also a religious kind of philosophical tradition which believes that our understanding of reality is only ever partial, either geographically, culturally, or even linguistically. There are things that we can understand, but that we cannot put into words, which I also find fascinating because if you're into technical understanding, we know from epidemiological evidence that without any form of articulation or language or pills or anything, the prognosis of people in hospital who have access to nature when they're recovering, their prognosis is much better. And that's beyond anything that you could articulate with language, potentially. And the blind man and the elephant simply articulates that idea. And I guess I want to finish with that because we have been in a period of history that has been both violent and colonial, and probably we'll always do that. But at the moment, we have caught ourselves in a trap of believing that we will get out of this with a set of solutions that come only from one vision and one philosophical transition and one historical moment. And I'm going to stop there because I think I've gone over time. Thank you.